my prediction is that if this were done properly today, targeting any buyer of Russian oil by the United States, the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, etc., I think that Putin would be out of business in 6 months. He would be begging to come to the table to negotiate a settlement.
Sir Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
We have to start off with this announcement on Wednesday, Donald Trump officially announcing that the United States will impose sanctions on two major Russian oil companies and their subsidiaries based in Russia. Trump said that these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies, and we hope that we won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled. So, Bill, I mean, you've been talking about this exact strategy for a while now. Obviously, Donald Trump's been watching the Trump Report and your many appearances on the show, but this is an interesting strategy that you said will practically help end the war. Are you still under that opinion?
Yeah, I am. Although I should point out that these sanctions themselves don't prevent Russia and those two companies from selling their oil to India, China, and Turkey. Those sanctions prevent those companies from setting up U.S. bank accounts, from buying U.S. products, etc. I've been arguing recently for secondary sanctions to be imposed on the 8 oil refineries, 2 in China, 4 in India, and 2 in Turkey, that buy their oil from those companies and from Russia. Those 8 refineries, since the war started, have purchased $400 billion worth of oil from Russia, which is, of course, the money that Putin uses to fund his war machine. So these sanctions are very good. These two companies are extremely important companies for the Russian economy. I'm certain that the CEOs of these two companies are running around in a state of apoplexy right now as they're trying to figure out what to do, what this means, how they can conduct their business. I'm sure it will hurt their business. I'm sure it'll hurt Putin's personal pocketbook. But this particular action is not going to end the war.
So, Bill, just for anyone who's kind of wondering what exactly these sanctions do, the US announced them, but then the EU followed suit and said that they were doing the same thing. Can you run me through how impactful just this would be for Russia and Putin's ability to fund his war, as you mentioned?
So what these sanctions do is so the United States has said that anybody that these two companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, can no longer do business with Americans. So Americans can't buy from them, they can't sell to them, they can't bank them, etc. They can also potentially affect banks that do business with America. So if a Chinese bank were involved in funding Lukoil, that bank could be sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury. And that's terrible. It's terrible. Well, it's good for Ukraine, terrible for Russia, terrible for Lukoil and Rosneft. But what it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that those companies can no longer sell their oil. And so if you have a Chinese oil refinery that's buying oil from Lukoil, at the moment, based on the sanctions that were issued last night, they can continue to buy oil from Lukoil. Now, there have been news reports today that suggest that a couple of the Indian refineries, one of them called Reliance, is considering stopping the purchase of Russian oil because they don't want to be at odds with the U.S. government. But they're not automatically sanctioned. There's a risk of future sanctions on them, but they are not automatically sanctioned. And so to the extent that we're trying to prevent Russian oil from being sold, there's still a few more steps that need to be taken.
So, Bill, you've spoken on this program about how if that was the implementation, if it did target Indian, Turkey, and Chinese buying of Russian oil, that it would be a pretty quick progress to not so much bankrupting, but really affecting the Russian economy. Can you walk me through how you think that timeline would go had Donald Trump and the EU implemented that measure?
Well, so they probably would have given a grace period of 6 weeks or whatever for these refineries to diversify their feedstock, the crude oil that they're buying. And then after that, if the sanctions were punishing enough, then they would stop buying Russian oil, and they would contact the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Venezuelans and the Nigerians and say, we want some of your oil. And probably that would be good for the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Nigerians, and not so good for Russia, because then all of a sudden Russia has a whole bunch of oil that nobody wants to buy. Now, somebody will buy that oil. The oil will find its way into the refineries of the world, but at a much lower price, because anyone who buys that oil runs the risk of ruining their businesses by being subject to U.S. sanctions. And so, if to the extent that that were to happen, I would suspect that the oil price that Russia would be able to sell at would be somewhere around $20 a barrel, whereas the current oil price is at $60 a barrel. And at $20 a barrel, all of a sudden, 2/3 of Russia's oil revenue has dissipated, has gone into the air. And what that means is that all this money that they're spending on North Korean missiles and Iranian drones and bonuses for young men to sign up to join the army, that money will be scarce. And at a certain point, the Russian economy will basically run out of money. And so my prediction is that if this were done properly today, targeting any buyer of Russian oil by the United States, the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, etc., I think that Putin would be out of business in 6 months. He would be begging to come to the table to negotiate a settlement.
Well, Bill, that measure, coupled with what the EU and what the US have announced, we're targeting these two oil companies. How does that differ from the secondary sanctions or the sanctions that Donald Trump has put in place on India as a penalty, the 25% tariff as a penalty for buying Russian oil? Of course, we haven't seen it happen with China yet, but how does this differ? How do you think it's more impactful to target these companies?
Well, because when you're involved in a major trade negotiation where you're sanctioning or tariffing the whole economy, then everything is at play. So there's a major, bilateral between two countries negotiation on all terms of trade, and surely this is just one of the things, and it becomes much less targeted and surgical. If you were to go to the refineries, and if I'm not mistaken, all of the Indian refineries are private businesses. They're not state-owned refineries. There might be one, but I think the majority are private businesses. And so if these refineries were targeted, then they have to make a choice. Do they want to do business with the rest of the world, or do they want to enjoy higher profits because they get some discounted Russian oil? And I think if they were basically threatened with being cut off from the rest of the world, so they couldn't sell to anybody in the United States, EU, etc. They couldn't buy from them. You couldn't bank with them. You couldn't insure with them. You couldn't get equipment, consultants, etc. I think that these refineries, these privately owned businesses, would say, you know what? I enjoyed that profitable, free money, discounted Russian oil while it lasted, but this is just too damaging. I don't want to ruin my business into perpetuity. I'm not going to get involved. And so it seems to me that the more targeted surgical attack is much better, and then it's not the overall trade negotiation. It's not relevant. I mean, there's lots of issues around a major trade negotiation, but this is targeting specific and individual businesses.
So, Bill, say you're in the room with Donald Trump and his advisory team. Are you saying to him, look, this was a great step forward, but there's still that measure to go?
Well, I would say that if your objective is to get Russia to stop attacking Ukraine, you need to put extreme pressure on them. This is a nice piece of pressure, but it's not enough. You need to basically make sure that Putin doesn't have the money to carry on, and this is the way to do it.
Bill, anyone that's read Red Notice understands what a big feature Gazprom is in your book. And I wonder, why do you think Trump and the EU didn't sanction Gazprom? It's Russia's biggest energy company. It's also the world's largest natural gas exporter, which of course means that the repercussions and the price hikes, spikes may have been too much of a risk for them. But do you think that's the reason why they didn't target Gazprom?
Well, I think the reason that Gazprom hasn't been targeted is that Gazprom is not actually that much of an exporter. So Gazprom used to be the major source of government tax revenue. I think Gazprom in the past paid 25% of all the government's expenses in terms of tax revenue. And that was because Gazprom had enormous export contracts to Europe. Now, the gas is a lot different than oil. Gas, you can't just load into a tanker. Well, you can in terms of liquefied gas, but it's not. Gas is a gas, and so basically, in order to get it to Europe and other markets, they had to put it into a pipeline. And so they built all these pipelines to sell their gas to Europe. Europe paid them a lot of money over many, many years, even during the Cold War. And then all of a sudden, when the war started, it wasn't the Europeans who said, we don't want Russian gas. It was the Russians that said, to punish you, we're going to stop selling you Russian gas. And Germany, which was the biggest buyer of Russian gas, said, oh my God, we've been doing everything we can to appease you, and now we can't buy Russian gas. But having said that, the Germans are an extremely efficient bunch, and they went out all over the world and they found other suppliers of gas, and they're now completely independent from Russia. And they're not planning on becoming dependent on Russia while this war is going on. And so they have this pipeline, which was built, which is the main source of exports, which no longer provides gas. And it's not like there's a whole bunch of other pipelines that were out there that they could just switch on. And so from a dollars and cents standpoint, going after the two biggest oil companies in Russia was the right move. The problem is that they went after the suppliers. They need to also go after the buyers. And that's when the real stranglehold would take place.
Unsurprisingly, Bill, Russia's former president Dmitry Medvedev, he said on Thursday that America's sanctions on these Russian oil companies was an act of war. He said they will, of course, say he couldn't help but be pressured in Congress. This doesn't change the main point that the decisions taken are an act of war against Russia. And now Trump has fully aligned himself with insane Europe. I mean, you and I have spoken at great lengths about how Donald Trump really does flip and switch teams. But are you worried that Donald Trump will believe Medvedev when he says that this is an act of war?
Donald Trump is a man with his own mind. Dmitry Medvedev is well known to be an alcoholic who says crazy stuff. And in fact, Trump has even attacked him for saying crazy stuff, using, as Trump termed it, the N word, the nuclear word. And so I don't think that Trump is going to be in any way swayed by Dmitry Medvedev. But again, the reason I'm not super celebrating right now is because President Trump has flipped back and forth so many times. Who knows what he's going to do next week? And so it's great that he's put these sanctions on. It wasn't particularly helpful in his statement to say, I hope they're not on for a long time, because that suggests that it's a temporary move. But nobody can predict Donald Trump other than Donald Trump.
Bill, before we get into the specifics of why this happened and kind of what's happened in the last few days, I haven't spoken to you since Trump and Zelensky had this meeting last Friday after Donald Trump and Putin had their 2-hour phone call. So when we say that Donald Trump switches and flips teams, how have you felt he's been in the last few days? Do you feel like he's been on the side of Ukraine or on the side of Russia?
Well, if you remember, Donald Trump was talking to Vladimir Zelensky about providing more weapons to help the Ukrainian war effort. And specifically, he was talking about providing Tomahawk missiles, which have a much longer range than the other missiles that the U.S. has provided. And Tomahawks could potentially hit targets as close as Moscow. And so that was something that the Ukrainians were pretty excited about. People who supported Ukraine were pretty excited about. And a meeting was set up in Washington for Zelensky to finalize the agreement on these Tomahawks. A day before the meeting in Washington, Putin called up Trump, and all of a sudden, according to reports, Trump got angry with Zelensky and started tearing up maps and throwing things around and swearing in the Oval Office. And I imagine if we had watched it on TV, it might have been as disgraceful and as demoralizing a meeting as the the first Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, where Trump and J.D. Vance started shouting at Zelensky and humiliating him in a very unjust way. And so Zelensky ended up, instead of getting tomahawks, he got shouted at and went home empty-handed. And that's what we were left with. And everybody felt pretty bad about that. I don't think that anyone other than Putin would have been happy about that. And then there was this idea that there would be another summit. After the Alaska summit, there would be another summit. And the summit would be in Budapest. And when I heard that, I kind of looked at a map and I said, there's not going to be a summit in Budapest for one simple reason, that Putin is a totally paranoid man. Remember, he sat at those tables with 35 feet long because he was so scared of sitting close to people. There's no way that Putin would go into airspace where he could be shot down. There's no way he would fly over countries where he could be, where they could bring his plane down and arrest him. And so I don't know practically how he would end up being in Budapest. But more importantly, when they started to talk about the framework of the negotiation, Putin's framework was exactly the same as it's always been, which is he wants a total victory over Ukraine. And that's not a negotiation. You can't just show up in Budapest and say, I want to surrender. And so I think that there was a phone call that took place between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and the Russians reiterated their point. It became clear that Putin probably didn't want to travel to Budapest, and there was nothing to discuss in Budapest. And that made Trump, of course, look weak and not in the right place on this particular issue. And at the same time, the American people are fully in support of Ukraine. The recent polling has shown that 75% of Americans think that Ukraine should be supported. They support military aid. I think more than 90% of Americans think that Putin is a villain. And of course, there are many of Trump's most strong allies, people like Lindsey Graham, who are fully on Ukraine's side, who are probably chomping at the bit, saying you need to do something. And so here we had it, this announcement. And I've always said, don't judge Trump by his words, judge him by his actions. And this is a very strong action. It may not end the war, but going after Lukoil and Rosneft, which supply 50% of Russia's oil, with U.S. Treasury sanctions is a strong move. There's no other way to characterize it.
The likelihood of this meeting, it's an interesting topic to discuss, Bill, and one I feel like hasn't really been covered enough. So Donald Trump, at his press conference yesterday, he told reporters that the meeting with Putin is now on hold, that he didn't want to waste meeting, referring to the summit. Of course, that was set for next month in Budapest, as you mentioned. You say it's because of obviously he's scared. And then we saw actually earlier this week, Dmitry Peskov, he was telling reporters on Tuesday about the meeting, and he was saying that there was no precise time frame for the initially set. He also said that it's impossible to postpone something when a reporter asked him if it would be postponed. He said it was impossible to postpone something that hasn't been set in stone. Preparation is needed, serious preparation. So my interpretation from that, Bill, that rhetoric, was that there was never really a strong chance that Russia had any intention of engaging in a summit, and it was yet another example of Russia and Putin trying to buy some more time.
Well, so there were two critical moments in the last few months where Putin needed to buy time. The first was when President Trump had threatened to impose sanctions, secondary sanctions on the buyers of Russian oil, which was what led to Putin quickly agreeing to the Anchorage, Alaska summit, where the red carpet for Putin summit, where he was. We don't know what was said in the beast, the Trump mobile, but something was said which talked Trump back from the ledge on that one, and he didn't impose those sanctions. And then Trump was talking openly about providing Tomahawk missiles to the Ukrainians, and then that led to this phone call, which again led to this summit discussion. And of course, now so they had a bad phone call, or I should say, Secretary of State Rubio and Lavrov had a bad phone call, but the Tomahawks are still not on the table. So this was a sort of half measure, not a full measure. The Tomahawks still need to be provided.
Yeah, and I want to read out what Donald Trump said about the Tomahawks. He was asked about it in a press conference. He basically, what he said, it was Zelensky left the White House saying that it wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and that's kind of where we're at with that. But then Trump, he was asked about it yesterday. He said it still takes at least 6 to 12 months for them to learn how to use tomahawks, and he said the only way a tomahawk is going to be shot is if we shoot it, and we aren't going to do it, assuming he means that US troops will be the ones to do it. So we're kind of really not sure where we're at with tomahawks. Obviously, he's spoken about how he's worried about the stockpile because the Tomahawk missiles that Ukraine would need are the ones that are launched from land as opposed to sea, and there's less of them. So we have to kind of see where we're at with Tomahawks. But Bill, I want to move on to something. You mentioned this meeting between Lavrov and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. They had a few phone calls where the premise of the conversation was to discuss freezing the battle lines. This was the proposal from the Trump administration. It would basically mean that both sides put down their weapons, they stop fighting and advancing wherever they are at now. That would essentially mean that land that Russia has occupied, which is around 88% of Donbass, 75% of Donetsk and all of Luhansk, would be under Russia just for right now until a negotiation is set in place. Ukraine accepted this knowing what a compromise it was, but Russia rejected the proposal. So, I mean, should this be the final nail in the coffin for Donald Trump, that Putin has yet again showed that he doesn't want peace, that he doesn't want this war to end, even though Donald Trump keeps saying that he knows that Putin does?
Well, I mean, it's all pretty straightforward and clear that Putin is not going to end the war. I mean, I could have told you that from day one, and I continue to tell you that right now, which is that Putin needs this war in order to stay in power, and he needs to stay in power in order to stay alive. And so he will continue to fight a war with Ukraine or with whoever else he needs to fight a war with in order to have a foreign enemy so he can stay in power. And so I'm hoping that this is the final nail in the coffin. I kind of doubt it is, just based on the body language and the actual language of what President Trump is saying. But it's interesting that every past president of the United States has had their moment with Putin as well. George W. Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and that sort of good feeling lasted for, I think, one meeting. And then the next 28 were kind of disastrous. And then President Obama organized the Russian reset, hoping to charm Putin into behaving himself. And of course, that didn't last very long. And so, perhaps, using the best interpretation of what's going on, President Trump had to go through the same psychological evolution before he came to the same conclusion. I don't think we're there yet, but and maybe we'll never be there. I mean, he continues to, speak very respectfully of Putin and very derogatorily about Zelensky. I mean, one of the images that really struck me was, after having U.S. soldiers putting out a red carpet, on their knees putting out a red carpet in Anchorage, that you had no U.S. officials whatsoever greeting Zelensky in Washington. You just had somebody from the Ukrainian embassy as he got off the plane. I mean, that was just, that kind of said it all, and that was no longer than a week ago. So for us to be thinking that all of a sudden Trump is, now discovered who Vladimir Putin is, I think is probably way too optimistic a statement. But I'd be glad to be proved wrong.
Well, Bill, Zelensky said the other day they're at least making some progress. Do you believe it, or do you actually believe that we are still at square one?
Well, no, I mean, there's no progress made with Putin. Although, let's see. I mean, so the U.S. imposed sanctions on Rosneft last night. So did Ukraine. Ukraine bombed a major Rosneft refinery last night. So it's hard to know at what point these sanctions, the Ukrainian drone sanctions and the U.S. financial sanctions, start to bleed Russian resources dry. As I've said, I think it all comes back to the buyers of Russian oil. But that's the only thing that's going to push Putin to negotiate, was when he feels like he's in a corner, when there's a boot on his throat.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.